All right, welcome back to Cyber Talk with Bob and Chris. I am Chris.
I'm Bob.
That's
Yeah,
Bob.
it's one way.
I
I don't
never
know.
remember which. I can't remember if my videos ever flipped. We are, by the way, we are technical geniuses. Just to make sure that we get that out there.
Technical geniuses. There you go. That's a new title for you. There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
So it's Friday the 13th. We can have technical glitches if the
Oh,
FAA can have them.
exactly. So this goes out to Tim and John because they asked for this, and we got asked for this 15 minutes before going live. So hey, this may be a fun bumpy ride. Let's put it that way. Unlike the people that tried to fly out Wednesday morning.
Yeah, it's usually I usually get the bumpy rides.
Yeah. So we got a request, and they want us to talk about the FAA outage that happened.
Okay.
So Bob and I were like, okay, well, give us a couple seconds. Let's do some research. Let's figure this out. I'll be honest, I don't study the FAA outages very often. No, luckily, the FAA is out less than Southwest Airlines. Oh,
Yeah, right.
That was a low shot. Okay. Yeah. So we did some research. We looked at it. So let's talk about it. So apparently Tuesday night they realized there was a problem with the system, and they knew they had to reboot the system. And yeah, so they rebooted it Wednesday morning, and wasn't working. So they switched to the backup system. But what was the problem with their backup system again?
It used the same data files apparently as the original system.
That's right. So when the data went corrupt, guess what? The backup system's worthless because it's still accessing the same corrupt data. So it turns out technicians were working on the main system, and they are banned from changing live data. Well, apparently they changed live data that may have caused this. So I know they're still doing their investigation, but it really highlights that having a backup system that accesses the same data isn't really having a backup. Now, from a hardware failure perspective, sure, if the hardware failed, the 30-year-old hardware, whatever they use, failed, they could have switched to the backup system as long as the data was intact. But the data wasn't intact. So this is a very important lesson for businesses. You have to make sure that you have a backup of your data, because a backup system, and some people, I'll use a good example of this, RAID. Let's say you have two hard drives that basically are clones of one another. That's RAID 1. That's the simplest terms I can use for RAID 1. People have told me before that RAID is backup. RAID is not backup. If the first drive that you have in there has a corrupt file on it, guess what? That's being replicated to the second drive.
Absolutely.
It's not backup. So we need backup. We need backup off-site. We need backup that's protected so it cannot be altered in any way. Some people will call that air-gapped. Basically, if somebody gets into your system and decides to alter your data or accidentally alters your data, you can recover it and get your business back up and running. Now, obviously, our businesses don't normally have as much press as the FAA going down and grounding all the flights in the United States. So luckily, we don't have that problem on our hands. But everybody is different. Everybody is in a different spot. If you're down for 3 or 4 hours during the peak of your business, what does that look like? What is the impact on your business? You think about that and then design a strategy around that. Clearly, the FAA did not think about that completely.
Well, to be fair, they might have thought about it, but they might have had inaccurate testing. Somebody said, "Oh, I start the new system, it works," and they move on. We don't know what kind of testing they did.
And that's a good point. If you're not testing your systems and you're not putting it through stress tests, you're not testing different scenarios, and sometimes you just figure out, unfortunately, in a live situation, that all your testing missed this one scenario that could have possibly happened.
Now, so yeah, they probably in that way. That's a different issue.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, if they have a corrupt file like next week and the same outage happens, then we have a different problem on our hands. But that's pretty much the skinny on that one. It teaches us all a good lesson. We need to have protected data, that's backed up someplace else. Also, since we're in the Friday the 13th grind and we're talking about the government, let's talk about the U.S. Department of Interior. oh, this one makes me happy. It shouldn't make me happy.
Were they using LastPass?
No. So they're the ones that control our national parks that are federal land, right? They have billions of dollars in budget. And they went through a nice little password situation where the Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Interior, basically their watchdog group, ran through a scenario because inside the U.S. Department of Interior, they had a password complexity policy. There's 12 characters, it's uppercase, lowercase, letters, numbers, and symbols. Typical password policy that has been proven over and over again is insufficient. Well, they claim that, hey, our passwords, it'll take 100 years to crack them.
Okay.
And we rotate them every 60 days. Yeah, 16% of their passwords, or about 14,000 passwords, were cracked in the first 90 minutes.
And how many of them were the same?
Actually, surprisingly, a lot. If you read the entire report, and this is something I made a video about this, but I didn't detail that because it's a 60-second video. If you actually pull the report up and you read, they had hundreds of accounts that had the same password across, like, just people that didn't even know each other.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like just hundreds of accounts. So to give everybody a primer, when you have a password in a Windows environment, you're not actually submitting your password, you're submitting the hash, which is just it's so your password doesn't get sent. That's easier way to do it. It's like a representation of your password. So the hash is matched on both sides. So when you submit a hash, like let's say the server looks at the hash, invalidates it's the same, and then authenticates you. So if you take that hash and you put it up against a password cracking rig, which in this case they spent $15,000 on a password cracking rig, which is
pretty cheap.
Pretty cheap, but pretty expensive. I mean, most people are going to spend 15 grand.
Yeah.
And yeah, they used something. A lot of people think in password hacking that it's always going to be brute force, to where you're just just running through the dictionary, running through letters. Well, no, actually, the most common way to do it now is to use word lists. So there's been these massive word lists that have been leaked on the internet between like RockU 2021. So they took that, they combined it with a few other word lists, including like United States politics, common words, and things like that, and like pop culture stuff. And
Dark
yeah,
web passwords.
Yeah, and in 90 minutes they got 16%. They ended up getting about a quarter of them, or I think it was like 21%, but that took them a little bit longer. And because they rotated their passwords every 60 days, they were forced to wait 90 days to test the passwords. But what they found out too is they had 288 of those accounts that they compromised that had elevated privileges.
Oh, jeez.
Which means, and one of them was a domain controller, was a domain administrator, and it was a stupid password. 362 were senior government employee accounts. So you can imagine what senior government officials have access to. That you probably don't want simple, easily defeatable passwords. But they also had MFA requirements that they found you could get around, single sign-on requirements that you could get around by just using a browser that didn't support single sign-on. So it failed back to just a single factor password.
Right.
Yeah. So
it's not just the small businesses that are having poor hygiene and people that, we need to trust things are working, but and secure. That's crazy.
And who would have thought that so many people, the second most frequently used password in the entire thing was Broncos 2012 with zeros and a dollar sign.
That's funny.
Yeah, who would have thought Denver Bronco fans were representing so much in the federal government for the U.S. Department of Interior? I was like kind of shocked by that one. I was like, all right, well, okay. I mean,
I like that password. I'm going to use it too. I didn't have to think about it.
Password -1234 was used. My favorite one is National Parks 2014 exclamation mark.
Nice.
Yeah, Winter 2021 was on there too. So, what this highlights at a bigger context is password complexity just doesn't work. And NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, they've talked about it. There's other data out there that says password length is more important. Using pass phrases like sentences and things like that is a much better option, especially for memorization for people. Because when you make something complex with 12 characters, what do people do? They change one character.
Yep.
And that doesn't change the complexity of the password, because if the password, like if I make winter 2023 exclamation mark is my password, and next year I change it to winter 2024 exclamation mark, you know how long it takes the computer to figure out that?
Well, the other thing I remind people too, it's not just a computer, there's real people looking at this stuff. And when they see 2022, let's go try 2023 because the old one's not working anymore.
Yeah,
and,
it's like simple. It's simple. And computers can, like, And something that looks random to a human is easily defeatable by a computer, especially with word lists and the way that you can apply filter rules and things like that. So the thing to learn here is it didn't take 100 years. It took 90 minutes for about 16% of them.
15K.
Yep. And they got a domain administrator, they got privileged accounts, they got senior government officials.
So that means, guys, they got access to everything. They would potentially have access to everything.
Yeah. Well, once you get a domain admin account, yeah, you're owned. You're owned. There's no going back from that. And even if once you get a government official, I mean, the amount of data they could get access to probably was pretty disgusting.
Yeah, the other thing, Chris, people need to remember that it's not just the domain admins that can getting, the bad guys getting a domain admin account. Yes, that makes it super simple for them. But, the first thing the bad guys do when they get into somebody's account is they're going to try and figure out how to get more privileges and more access, more stuff. And, if you talk to Kyle, they're effective probably 90% of the time, 99% of the time, finding a vulnerability and going up.
Yeah. Well, and that you also lead to other things. They get access to the email, they can impersonate people. So can you imagine if a senior government official is being impersonated, like what else they could get access to?
Sure.
Or they're sending emails from this person and getting people to do things that they normally wouldn't do, or seeing stuff they shouldn't get. So the point here is rotating passwords is an old school way of thinking. Using complex passwords that are 12 characters is an old way of thinking. Passwords in general suck, and we need to get away from passwords, but that's not reality right now. And there's things coming that we hopefully can get past this. But if you're going to construct a password, make it a phrase, make it 16, 20 characters, something you can remember. Use password managers if you want to truly generate randomized passwords for websites and things like that. Use that. Or protect it with a passphrase and don't reuse it.
Yep.
And don't just think that a single factor like a password is the end all be all. There's other things we should be doing. Multi-factor authentication. We should be doing biometrics. Maybe in the government's case, they actually usually get a card for their multi-factor authentication that they have to carry around with them. So, they had protections in place that were easily defeated. And again, testing this was important. Like having the Office of Inspector General coming and testing them shows them where their gaps are. The FAA, unfortunately, didn't understand one gap, but like as they test and they learn from this, you're going to identify gaps in your business. You're going to identify gaps in your security. And the idea is to figure out how can we fill this gap? How can we stop this from being a problem? And it's a continuous thing. You're not going to just solve it tomorrow.
So that really goes to what small business can do today is really work with a team to go ahead and do a security risk assessment of what's going on. But like you said, it's not a one-time thing. This is ongoing testing. Some of the watch tools that services that we've got going right now can actually automate some of this, but we can know what's going on before the bad guys do.
Yeah. And by the way, if your password is change it now, probably good advice to take. Change it 1, 2, 3. Again, follow your advice.
I saw there was one place I was at. A lot of people had the password Xerox. It wasn't a Xerox company, but they liked it as a password. I don't know why.
Password 1234 was used in 274 accounts. 44 of them somehow violated the password age, so they had not been rotated in 60 days.
Yeah, and those are probably the IT guys.
Do you want to know what the domain admin password was?
Go ahead.
It was Orlando _ and 4 zeros, and the first O in Orlando was a 0. And that was shared with 160 accounts had that password. 158 of them violated the 60-day rotation policy, and that one was a domain administrator account.
Well, here's the thing. If you got so many accounts that didn't violate the policy, I would venture to guess that they're changing their password and then changing it back. Because they probably didn't have a reuse limit on them.
Well, they probably didn't have minimum password age either.
Yeah.
But I don't know how they determined, like one of them, password -1234 was the most reused. It was used with 478 accounts, and 407 of those violated the age policy. So they didn't have a hard age policy. Or like you said, they were able to defeat it. somehow. Yeah. And by the way, password -1234 had an elevated privilege. It's kind of amazing. It's like password $123 had 3 elevated privileges. Password $123 had 2 elevated privileges. 1234 password $sign had 3. Again, this is like dangerous stuff. We have privileged accounts that have way too many permissions in general, have passwords like that. And to give people one less context, if you reuse passwords inside of an environment, so when you have 478 people that have the same password, that's one hash. And there's things that you can do when you're looking at doing like penetration testing in network, you can do something called pass the hash. If you have that hash and that's available, you can just pass it, and you can apply that to pretty much every account or however many accounts, and just kind of passwords, basically hash spray that and see what you can get access to. So it's not that difficult. And it was funny because in the report too, they go back to the Department of the Interior, and they put in their PDF. They're like, "What do you think about this?" And they were like, "Well, we concur with the assessment. We concur." What else are they going to say?
Yeah, right.
They're going to say, "That's not right. Like, you guys are wrong." No, here's your passwords, and go from there.
You know, so you got Department of Interior doing that, but then you come along with and now we got the FTC is reaching out and has got those new FTC security guidelines we talked about a few weeks ago, and now they've got stricter rules for what auto dealerships need to do, among other people, and
there's some ambiguity there with like configuration changes and like tracking that, and like when you need to have vulnerability assessments versus pen test. It's not cut and dry on what satisfies the requirements.
Like you said, the ambiguity is some people are calling pen tests risk assessments or scans. So,
well, and then they say if you have less than 5,000 records, you're bound by one rules. But then it's like, well, what defines a record? So is one customer a record, or is each piece of information on a customer a record that you have? Which means you can pass 5,000 way quicker with less customers than if it's one customer record. Yeah. And they don't define that very well. Maybe somebody can answer that for us.
I was talking to somebody this morning who owns a motorcycle dealership.
Oh, they'll fall underneath that.
But the guidelines explicitly say automobile.
Yeah, but they also define a type of business.
Yeah, so that's what I said. I said, you don't explicitly call you out, but you are you could technically be a finder. You could also, you're also providing leasing with consumer information, and the whole aspect of the FTC reg is to protect consumers.
Well, and it's your responsibility to make sure you're following the guidelines. So if the FTC comes knocking, it's on you to prove that you were doing the stuff, not on them to prove necessarily that you had to follow those rules. So you might want to understand, talk to some qualified professionals that can give you good guidance on whether you should be following those rules or not. And then talk to somebody like us if you want some help with satisfying some of them.
If the FTC comes knocking, it's going to be a bad day.
I mean, it's only criminal and civil penalties.
Anyway, I think that's enough for Friday the 13th. We're at 19 minutes here.
Tim, John, comment. We'll be watching.
Have a good week, everyone. Chris and I will be in Phoenix next week, and we'll probably do something in some weird venue. I'm down. We got to find a good one for this. All right, till next week.